Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on weaving global competence into law and business education. We're going to wait a little bit for the rest of the attendees to join, but in the meantime, make yourselves comfortable. We're going to start in a minute. Welcome, everyone. While you join and while we wait for the other attendees to join our webinar, I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you want to. We're going to wait one more minute for everyone to join, and then we will start. Thank you for your time today, for joining us. Please introduce yourselves in the chat so we can know where in the world are you, where are you connecting from, and what's your role? Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My colleague Molly and I welcome you to this webinar on weaving global competence into law and business education. Greetings from New York. And I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you for your time, for your energy to be here. Please make yourselves comfortable now and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat to tell us where you're connecting from, what's your role, what's your institution, and what is the reason for you to be here? What are you curious about? Because we're going to have an exciting and really interactive webinar today with our two wonderful guests. And let's start. Please note before we begin, by now, I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with how the online settings work now, especially Zoom, probably. We're going to use the questions and answers tool, or you can also use the chat as well. If you have any questions, we recommend using the questions and answers tool so you can make yourselves be read, especially for our guests, so we can answer your questions later. You can use the chat to interact with other attendees in the Zoom room. This webinar might include polls and interaction with the panelists. It's going to be something very, very light, actually, just a conversation. There is a designated time for those questions and answers at the end of the webinar. However, questions for our panelists are welcome at any time using that function. If you have any questions about websites, forms, dates, how to enroll, you can use the chat to do that. We can answer to those questions at any point. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you afterwards. We're going to upload it to our AFS YouTube channel. So today we are super glad and happy to present you Weaving Global Competence into Law and Business Education with two key partners, the University of St. Thomas School of Law and Purdue Global Business. And for that, we're going to count with two wonderful guests that my colleague Molly is going to introduce.
Thank you, Andrés. So again, we're so happy to be joined by Professor Carl Warren and Professor Jennifer Teague. A little background on each of them. So Professor Carl Warren has extensive background as a trial attorney for the Minnesota Attorney General's Office in the area of human rights enforcement. He was a faculty member of the University of Minnesota Law School, where he taught in its civil practice clinic. In 2016, Professor Warren joined the clinical faculty at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, where he directs the Community Justice Project, a policy-based clinic in which student attorney practitioners investigate social justice issues that are adversely affecting the community and develop and seek to implement policy-making solutions. Professor Warren has taught and been a frequent speaker on issues concerning race, civil rights, and the impact of bias on perception, judgment, and the administration of justice and practice of law. Thanks for joining us today. We also have Professor Jennifer Teague, who is the program lead for global business and the School of Business Education Abroad programs at Purdue University Global. Prior to joining Purdue Global in 2008, she held faculty positions in the UK and Norway and was the director of Norwegian Center for International Competence. And as you just heard from my colleague Andrés, he is our educational products coordinator for our Global Up products here at AFS International. And I'm the Global Up manager and lucky to work alongside Andrés and Anais, who is currently providing technical support for this webinar as well. So we'll go over just a couple agenda items. So first, we have a general overview of our Global Up programs so that you can kind of understand what we're talking about here today. We'll hear from Professor Warren on global competence in law school, Professor Teague on global competence in business school, and then we'll have time for audience questions at the end. But first, we would really like to hear from you. So what region are you joining us from? And what is your role at your organization or institution? So my colleague Anais has launched a poll where you can select your region. I'll give you just a minute to look at that. Okay, so we can launch the results there. Looks like we have a lot of colleagues from Africa and Asia, North America, South America. So quite a mix of regions joining us today. Thank you. And now we'll hear, what is your role at your organization or institution? So we have a couple options. It could be a volunteer, student, program team member, director, educator, administrator, executive, faculty, or something else. Maybe you feel like you belong in a few of those categories, and that's fine too. Okay. So it looks like we have a couple volunteers with us today. A student is joining us, a program team member. We have some directors, some educators, administrators as well. So excellent. It's just great to kind of get some context for what you do on in your day-to-day life. So thank you for sharing. I'll turn it over to Andrés to talk a little bit about our programs.
Thank you, Molly. I'm going to make a short introduction about what does it mean to global up, to give some context of what we do at AFS International, what are the global up programs, and what is the Global Competence Certificate. So the AFS Global Up program empowers students and faculty and staff with tangible global skills that are essential to live, learn, work, and make a positive social impact in diverse settings, on campus, at work, in local communities, and around the world. That's why we have different versions that you might have seen if you're familiar with the program. We have the Global Up Abroad, the Global Up at work, at home, teen, the newly launched Educator. And we believe that the world is changing and adapting so fast. And I think that that's more relevant than ever after 2 years of pandemic. It's changing in accelerating rates, and we believe that global skills are more relevant than ever to navigate into a super multicultural world, whether it is in all of these settings that I was just mentioning in your daily lives, professional settings, and the university. Traveling and international education have been impacted greatly, and moving forward is going to be very different from now on. That's why we believe that it is the same for teaching and learning, right? Online learning will be a core part of the new normal. And I think that by now everyone just simply got used to being in an online setting. And that's what the Global Lab program is doing. So I'm going to explain what the Global Lab program includes. The Global Lab program includes modules with video content, case studies, discussion forums, self-assessment tools, and quizzes. That's why we call it a multimodal program. With a flipped classroom approach. That means that the learners go through the content first and then discuss it on a facilitated dialogue session. that's how we call it. It's a 90-minute session every couple of modules in which the participants have the opportunity to reflect on what was learned and doing some other kind of reflection and exercises with the support of a qualified facilitator that is trained specifically by experts at AFS International. That includes up to 4 facilitated dialogue sessions, completing the video content modules and discussions on the platform that you can see on the right side, called Bridge. Our learning management system takes 10 to 12 hours to complete. And as I was saying, it includes reflection, engaging with peers in virtual communities of practice, and not only within a cohort of participants from one specific institution, but from participants from all over the world, depending on the program that you choose. It is flexible, it is based on individual needs. And if you're curious about the different options that we have, I invite you to check on our website, what's the difference between doing an abroad program at home, at work, teen, or educator. And upon completion, participants earn the AFS Global Competence Certificate, which features all the skills that are included and the content of the curriculum of the program. In the image, you can see a facilitated dialogue session by one of our qualified facilitators with some exercises. We believe that this guidance and mentorship is key for learners to go through the program. Just doing it online without any guidance or opportunity to reflect on these topics is not enough. We need to have always this opportunity to connect with others and see how the other learners are understanding these concepts and make meaning of the world, especially when we talk about global skills, global competence, intercultural learning, and global citizenship. You can see on the screen too, a couple of our partners, the partners that we are working with. You can see here the University of St. Thomas and Purdue University Global. Not only these are based in the US, but we have a couple of partners in Europe as well, in South America, in Africa, and we welcome you to join us too.
Thank you, Andrés.
Okay, hand it over to you, Molly.
Excellent. So before I jump into some questions for Professor Warren, I will go over just a couple snapshots of what the University of St. Thomas School of Law, includes. So, when we look at the total class size, so there's 162 students. The average age is 24. They have 21% of minority enrollment. So just a couple of stats there. You can take a peek at some of the clinics and externships that students get involved in as part of the School of Law. And it ranks number 8 for quality of life. And 100% of JD students are paired with a mentor for their entire legal education. So some unique aspects there. Also, when you look at some of the employment opportunities that they seek after graduation, you can kind of look through that list there as well. And where the alumni work, there's 23 countries where alumni have found themselves following their graduation. So when we're talking about why global competence is necessary, you can see like they aren't, just staying around Minnesota or the United States. They're working all over the world as well. So first, before we talk more broadly about global competence, Professor Warren, I would love to hear just a little bit more about the court or the program that you're using it with. So the Community Justice Project, how is Global Up being used? And what else can you tell us about this course that students are taking? Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. As you explained, the Community Justice Project is a clinical program at the law school. And like most law schools have clinics, which are like law firms within the law school where the faculty are practicing attorneys who supervise the students handling real cases. and more often than not, as first-year attorneys, with the help and mentorship of the faculty. And so it's an opportunity for them to take what they're learning in the classroom, the theories, the concepts, and apply them in real life situations, representing real life clients dealing with real life problems. So we found over the course of, I don't know how many years we've been using AFS in the Global Competence Certificate Program, but it's been for a number of years now. And what we do is, in the beginning of our classroom portions of the clinic courses, we go through the GCC certificate program with the students, and have opportunity not only for them to review the materials that AFS provides, but in the online modules, but then to have these facilitated discussions with them where we can actually apply them to what they're doing. So that's we found that's been very effective. In this day and time of people being very cautious about talking, expressing their views in front of people who may not share the same views, it's given us the ability to create a safe space for talking about these momentous issues. And I think the students, for the most part, have really appreciated that.
Excellent. Well, yes, we've certainly loved having the partnership with St. Thomas and the School of Law. And I think for those who are kind of in the field of international education, it can be just a really unique partnership to have, a law school involved in building global competence. So let's dive into our first question for you. So more broadly speaking, why do law school students need global competence education, in your opinion?
Well, it's I believe it's vital to the practice of law and vital for students preparing to enter the practice of law, because perhaps one of the most important revelations that we as attorneys or law students can achieve is to understand the illusory nature of objectivity. As human beings, we are inclined to believe that what we see is what exists, and more often than not, we draw conclusions, make decisions, and act upon what we believe we perceive. In so doing, we fail to take into account the myriads of factors, including stereotypes, that influence our interpretation of what we see. Stereotypes can be inherent and at times subconscious, and as a result, they can seem to us to be as natural and unerring as our other human senses. Because of this, they often go unchallenged in our thinking. I mean, we're not even aware that we are filtering what we see. So it's not a stretch to think of stereotypes as being filters that define what we perceive, and in so doing affect our judgment, our decision making, and actions. And it's stereotypes are very insidious. I mean, James Jones wrote a book entitled Prejudice and Racism. And in it, he listed many ways in which permitting stereotypes to affect our perception and decision-making process could lead to dysfunctional results. And his list included such things as stereotypes are factually incorrect, they are often illogical in origin, they're often based on prejudice, those who hold them are often irrationally resistant to new information that contradict the stereotypes. They exaggerate group differences. They often imply genetic origins of group differences, and the list goes on and on and on. One of the legal scholars who has focused on the problem of that are faced by cross-cultural lawyers. Her name is Susan Bryant, and she wrote an article a number of years ago called The 5 Habits Building Cross-Cultural Competence in Lawyers. And she said, to become good cross-cultural lawyers, Students must first become aware of the significance of culture on themselves. Culture is like the air we breathe. It is largely invisible, and yet we are dependent on it for our very being. Culture is the logic by which we give order to the world. Culture gives us our values, attitudes, and norms of behavior. We are constantly attaching culturally based meaning to what we see and hear, often without being aware that we are doing so. Through our invisible cultural lens, we judge people to be truthful, rude, intelligent, or superstitious based on the attributions we make about the meaning of their behavior. So the assumptions that result from our invisible cultural lenses have profound implications for the practice of law and the administration of justice. For lawyers, being aware of the impact of implicit bias and stereotypes is not only necessary to being or becoming a morally awake human being, it is essential to the competent practice of law. The Minnesota Rules of Professional Conduct, one of its rules, its first rule, in fact, requires that a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. Competence requires that a lawyer pay attention to how their culturally conditioned perceptions of their clients can impact their expectations about their cases, as well as their own and their clients' behavior and performance. A lawyer cannot hope to effectively represent an individual of a different race, culture, gender, national origin, etc., or properly analyze an issue involving such factors if he or she does not understand the implications that such differences have on all aspects of the matter, from the assumptions they are inclined to make as part of their own analysis of the case, to such considerations as assessment of credibility, motives, goals, the existence, nature, and extent of an injury, and what is appropriate relief. The being of a different culture from their client can affect the attorney-client relationship in a number of ways. It can influence the ability of the lawyer and client to form a trusting relationship, the lawyer's ability to evaluate the client's credibility, the lawyer's ability to develop client-centered case strategies and solutions, the lawyer's ability to get information, and the lawyer's ability to attribute the intended meaning from behavior and expressions. So in order to effectively represent someone from a different culture, it is essential that a lawyer first analyze their own culture and the influence it has on him or her, or especially as it pertains to categorizing other people. Cultural self-awareness is the key because it enables us to recognize that as cultural beings, we may hold attitudes and beliefs that can detrimentally influence our perceptions of and interactions with individuals who are ethnically and racially different from ourselves.
Yes, yes to all of that. You are reminding me of our webinar we did last month on why even for engineers, global competence education is so important when finding a solution for a problem. And the same as when you're going to represent, a case or a group or individual, like taking all of that into account is so important. So you did talk about, why this cultural training is so relevant to those who are becoming lawyers. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of addressing bias in the justice administration?
Well, I mean, it's, in order to achieve a fair and just result, we have to come to grips with the influence of bias, implicit bias, explicit bias on the process itself. It's and we have to recognize that bias exists, probably at every level of the justice process, from police investigations or deciding who to pull over. You probably heard the phrase driving while black.
Yes.
But for a lawyer, they have to first understand how bias is affecting their own perspectives so that they can effectively represent their client. But they also have to recognize that since the system is run by human beings who all are fallible and subject to influence by bias, they have to understand that that's happening and be able to account for it in how they represent their client and present their client's interests, protect their client's interests. So I think key to this is the realization that bias exists and that it can influence, because once an attorney or a law student for that matter understands that, then they can actually take steps to account for it.
Definitely. Yeah, and those are all great examples, from police to representing those who have been impacted maybe by police bias as well. So, you know, I know you are also working with some law school students that are interested in impacting policy and addressing some of the issues in the community, making things better for all. So with, you know, the cultural training that would be relevant for those who want to do policy work, can you talk a little bit, why is global competence important for those who are seeking to impact policy changes?
Well, you know, it's in a policymaking clinic, it's different from most other types of clinics in the law school, in that the typical clinic mirrors the general practice of law, where you have an attorney representing an individual and assisting them in solving their individual problems. The policymaking clinic is like flying at 36,000 feet and looking down at the community as a whole and seeing what types of problems, social justice problems, are adversely affecting the community as a whole or large segments of it. And so, and it's important for students doing this type of work, just as it is important for students or lawyers who are representing individuals dealing with individual problems. It's as important for students who are doing this broad-based, community-wide representation to understand the impact of bias in the issues that are affecting communities, so that they can, first of all, identify the problem, but then also come to understand what would be effective solutions, especially from the perspective of people who are being adversely affected, who are from a culture, race, etc., you know, who are different in their perspectives and in their life experiences from that of the lawyers who are trying to help them.
Excellent. Yeah, it's so exciting to hear about. It just makes me think, even in examining some of the laws that have been put into practice, created with, you know, historical bias, maybe things have changed and evolved. So having that 360-degree kind of look at how it's impacting the community today just sounds like incredible work that you're doing with those students. So thank you.
I mean, in this day and age, I mean, it doesn't take, there's so many things that are happening that are providing examples. You know, like, for example, one of the current issues that the community is intensely focused on has to do with the use of no-knock warrants. There are other things, other types of issues too that are affecting the community as a whole, or at least adversely affecting the marginalized portions of the community. You know, things like like environmental justice, the fact that the air quality in marginalized neighborhoods in the community is much worse than in the non-marginalized aspects of more affluent neighborhoods in the community, and because of the location of polluters in marginalized communities. And so, knowing the historical factors pertaining to race, ethnicity, national origin, that explain why the air quality and the adverse health impacts from that exists, is necessary in order to shape effective solutions.
Definitely. For our international audience members, a no-knock warrant that Professor Warren is talking about in terms of maybe changing the policy is when police can obtain a warrant and not have to knock on the door before entering. So it's been a hot topic recently, especially in the Twin Cities where we both are located, but nationally as well. So being able to impact that policy if police should have the ability to not have to knock and basically break down a door, bust into a home without announcing their presence. So Carl, the final question I have before I'll let audience members ask you after we hear from Jennifer is, when you think about what's the risk to a law school student who doesn't receive global competence education or cultural training?
Okay. Well, I'm always telling my students that assumptions are a lawyer's Achilles heel. If a lawyer is not aware of the effect of like adverse stereotypes, implicit bias on their own perceptions, decision making, their conclusions, their actions, if they're not aware of that and they believe that what they see as is reality, and is a reality not just for them, but it's the same reality for people of different culture, different races that they may be attempting to represent, then they run the risk of prejudging a situation and sort of imposing their perspective, and not just their perspective, but also the assumptions as to what their client's perspective, what their client's goals are, what would constitute effective relief. They can totally miss the mark on that. So it's vital that in order to be able to account for it and in order to make sure that it's not adversely affecting a lawyer's perceptions, they have to be aware that this impact exists, so that they can actually watch out for it and account for it. I think one of the things that we really appreciate from the Global Certificate Training Program is the concepts and tools that it provides attorneys to be sensitive to these differences based on different cultures and race, et cetera. And then to be able to kind of account for them, to understand and be able to kind of go through an exercise in your mind that can help you kind of isolate it and understand it's happening and then deal with it.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much, Professor Warren, for sharing your thoughts on those questions. We'll move to allow for Jennifer to share on business as well. So let me share my screen again. And if you have questions for Professor Warren at this time, you can start to put them into the chat as well. So we'll get to those in just a bit.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Professor Warren. That was really interesting to see. I hope that people have questions for you later. I have some myself. But now let's jump into the next part of the webinar, and I would like to invite Jennifer Teague, professor and program lead of the Global Business and Education Abroad programs of the School in Business and IT at Purdue University Global, to talk a little bit about her experience using the programs and talking about incorporating global competence into her curriculum. Welcome, Jennifer. How are you?
Thank you so much, Andrés. I'm well. And thank you to AFS and the Global Up team for having me here to talk with you about one of my favorite subjects, which is global competence. Andrés, can you advance the slides or do I need to? Perfect. So I am with Purdue University Global in the School of Business and IT. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Purdue Global, we are part of the renowned Purdue University system, but we are a fully virtual campus. And two things that I think tell the story of Purdue as a whole, but Purdue Global as well, is the fact that the system is constantly in the top 10 most innovative universities in the US, meaning that they are at the forefront of a lot of movements when it comes to degree offerings, educational technology used, and starting to confront issues that we know need to be addressed by our future graduates. And we're also one of the brands that matter, according to Fast Company. And the reason that is really important to us is that is an award that is based on cultural impact and social engagement. So we are putting out there that we believe that diversity and innovation and inclusion and international competence are important things. And then we're following through with the offerings that we have for our students. So on the next slide, I've just kind of given a quick overview of what our student body looks like. And the reason that this is really important is it's the beginning of the story as to how we got to the GCC program. So our student body is almost entirely composed of non-traditional adult learners. We have over 31,000 students from all over the world, and more than half of them are over the age of 30. About a third of them have a military affiliation. Half of them are first-generation college students, and about 58% have a child or other dependent in the home that they're looking after. And the reason that that's important is because in dealing with non-traditional adult learners, sometimes they miss out on those more traditional opportunities like education abroad. For anybody that has had the privilege of participating in an education abroad or a study abroad program during their studies, you know that that's one of the formative experiences that a lot of people walk away from university with, saying that made a difference in how I see the world. And while everybody else during the pandemic on physical campuses were thinking, how do we go virtual? Because we were already virtual, we started thinking, how can we move into a physical realm? And our senior leadership tasked a group inside the School of Business with designing an education abroad program. And it was twofold. Number one, we wanted to be able to get students on planes and take them to other places in the world so that they could stand in another country and they could see and smell and hear and interact with a different culture to build that international experiential learning. But we also were aware that some of our students, because they fall into some of those demographic categories, might not be able to get on a plane for 10 days, or might not be able to afford the fees that would be associated with travel, or might not be able to take time off work or time away from an aging parent or child. And so we also at the same time created a coordinated virtual program. So our programs run at the same time to the same location, and half of our class might get on the plane and go. Our last trip was to London in March. So we had a group that went with us in person, and a shout out, actually one of those participants is with us today, as well as one of the faculty members who went with us and is part of the program. And we also had students who were back in the US, and they were participating in synchronous and asynchronous events so that they could be part of that cultural immersion as well through the virtual opportunity. So I'm going to talk specifically about business and how these programs are beneficial there. So inside the School of Business, and I will definitely forget at least one or two of our areas, but we focus on concentrations in human resource management, different aspects of IT, project management, leadership, organizational behavior, global business, which is the program that I'm affiliated with. We have marketing and we have general management. So we have all, and a new construction management program as well. So we have all these amazing offerings, and not one of them will not have some aspect of global interaction, whether that individual never gets on a plane and leaves the US, or whether they're working predominantly in other countries. They are going to be interacting not just with people from other cultures, but they're going to be interacting with globalized concepts and globalized systems and globalized institutions. So when we think about who needs global competence, the answer is really everybody. But for our specific purposes, we embedded the GCC inside of courses that hold our education abroad travel and virtual experiences. So they also provide a really cool incentive to earn not only the degree or certificate program accolade, but also a standalone certificate that's offered through AFS that we administer through PG. So we actually have two electives, an undergraduate and a graduate version, that are building global competence. And the GCC is embedded in that, along with our field experiences. We also have the GCC embedded in the final course in our 4-course global business concentration, global strategy. And we also have a new version of a globalized MBA capstone that the GCC will also be embedded inside of. And the reason it was important for us to embed the GCC was to give some structure to that education abroad experience. To simply get on a plane or have a virtual interaction with someone in another country is impactful without a doubt. But the GCC, we really felt like, gave us a framework to do 3 things. The material is wonderful at helping you reflect on how you see yourself culturally. That's important to have that self-knowledge. It's also important to look at how you see others. What are your, and Professor Warren talked about this a little, what are your stereotypes and biases? How can you mitigate some of them? What kind of generalizations do you make about people from other cultures? How can those be helpful and harmful? And then finally, to me, the most unique and really a key piece of global competence learning and the GCC program in particular is looking not just how do I see myself, how do I see others, but how do others see me? Because that part of self-knowledge is something that we don't always focus a lot on. And in a business context in particular, that's really important. If you're working with a group of individuals from different cultures, whether that's nationality or whether it's some other definition of a cultural group, you want to know how others might react to you so that you can work against those stereotypes, so that you can be an active participant in creating an empathetic and a tolerant and a productive environment. That's on a small scale. If we extrapolate that to companies working with global institutions or other international organizations, we want to be aware of some of those institutional biases and stereotypes that might be present so that we can work to mitigate them. When we kind of reflect on what our students are saying, a lot of the feedback that we got about the GCC program from our cohort was that it transformed career direction. We had one individual who applied for a promotion in a very international focused part of her organization, and she received the promotion, and she emailed and said, I think that earning that certificate and the global business concentration in general is really what made me the most preferred candidate, which is really cool to hear. It opens eyes to the perspective of others. We heard that from several individuals, prompted them to reflect on their own cultural identity, because in business in particular, I think we rely on the work of Hofstede, or we look at the Globe studies, and we think of culture solely as being nationality. And culture, as everyone here knows, I'm sure, is so much more than that. It's so much more than just one moniker. So having that opportunity to reflect on different aspects of culture, I think, is really beneficial for business students. And my very favorite conversation that I had about the GCC, because our theme was empathy, right? That's something that we're really striving to develop when we learn about other cultures. One of the students came to me while we were in London, and they had been out to see Phantom of the Opera. And she said, "This has ruined Phantom of the Opera for me." And I said, "How could that possibly be?" And she said, "Because at the end, when the Phantom says, 'The world showed no kindness to me,' all she could think was, 'I wonder what's been going on that made him feel this way.'" And I thought it was hysterical, but also such a great kind of light explanation of how, when we start looking through the eyes of others, through that knowledge of self, it's really impactful with how we relate to the world.
That is wonderful. And I was actually very curious to know that story. But when we read that part of this slide in particular, I wanted to know why, because Molly and I were talking about it and we had a couple of theories, but it's so amazing to see that once you gain these global skills and competencies, it's very hard not to be aware all the time of the cultural differences, the different types of communication, different kinds of conflict that we can have, right? And use them and apply them in our real lives all the time. So it's wonderful that your students experience that too. Sorry about that experience in particular that ruined it, but it's so interesting to see. And I wanted to ask you about that experience in London, because you led that your first education abroad program and launched the concentration and micro credential in global business. That's and right. About that experience, I wanted to ask you, why do you think that in the global business field it's important to develop global competence, education and skills?
I think there's a very practical answer to that. For those of you that have seen the recent update from the US Department of Education, they have, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, they've adopted a new international strategy. And one of the pillars of that new international strategy is to increase cultural competence among US students and to increase knowledge of working with other cultures. So at a very large institutional level, we're recognizing that we have to have these skills. The other piece of that is when we're thinking about why we get a degree, employability is a big piece of that. And organizations like the National Association of Colleges and Employers have put out survey after survey over recent years saying one of the #1 skill sets that they feel are important for new graduates to have is intercultural competence. The flip side of that is one of the skill sets most employers say is lacking in most graduates is intercultural competence. So it's imperative that we hear what the workplace is saying, what the government is saying, what society as a whole is saying, is that we have to develop knowledge, understanding, and empathy towards those that are different than us. And I think it's worth mentioning that, when we talk about global competence, we're talking about international competence, right? But I think we're also talking about global in a universal sense, so that there's this move to stop looking at culture just as nationality, but to looking at this wider definition of what our culture might look like for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's you mentioned a couple of times, and I think people will be able to realize that you, Jennifer, and Professor Warren as well are qualified facilitators of this program. So you dominate this content, and the way you speak about the stereotypes, generalizations, and Hofstede's theories make us realize that you really incorporate all of these things in your teaching style as well, and how you speak about these things. And you mentioned something so important that I agree so much about, the importance of having an international experience, but maybe not being enough, or people not having the opportunity to go abroad, and that not being actually an obstacle for you to develop global competencies, right? So you mentioned some students that went on an abroad program, but needed to complement that experience, that international experience, with the content of the global programs, and some students that were actually not traveling, but were able to see that content and still develop the same skills. So I wanted to know from you, how come you decided to, or in which moment you realized that it was important to incorporate this program, the global programs, in an international experience, and how that worked with the different kinds of students and groups that you have?
I think we always knew from the outset that global competence isn't something that we break out into a separate box and say, here, we'll learn about this here. It's interwoven throughout everything that we do, not just when we talk about global business, but as to Professor Warren's points, it's in law, it's in engineering, it's in every field. So it's not something that I think we can ever say, here, I've learned it. I think it's something that we have iterative conversations about throughout all our learning opportunities, both formal and informal. But I think part of it was really a moment where we were working with our main campus, our West Lafayette campus. And for those of you in the field, you'll know that the research and the practical work that comes out of the International Office at Purdue is absolutely amazing. So when I was researching, I was in the academic literature first, reading about the importance of embedding intercultural competence in global business programs. And I came across several papers that were actually published through the International Office at Purdue. So I was fortunate enough to be able to turn to them as my colleagues and say, what are you using to produce such amazing outcomes? And they were using the Global Competence certificate program. And that was the point where we entered conversations, and everything that was kind of on my wish list of what I would cover if I were to start from scratch, it was already in the program. And so I think not only was it a practical time saver, but I love that the students have one more modality to interact with in terms of how they take this information on. Because of course, this kind of dialogue, having seminars, having conversations is important. Academic learning, reading resources is important. But I really like that in the GCC program, there's activities that ask them to reflect directly on their own identity. I think that self-reflection part is really, really important. And it's hard to generate that in a classroom without some kind of structured material like the GCC modules.
Wonderful. I believe that in the past we had a conversation, it was behind the scenes, but I mentioned to you that like putting myself in the shoes of a student or thinking about my time when I was a student, I thought it would be so cool that a professor like you would have showed me that in the past. Like I wish I had a teacher that would have included this kind of content in my subjects when I was in college. And I wanted to know from you, what are your students saying about this? How the experience has been, besides the comment about Phantom of the Opera? What are they saying? And have you seen any changes in not only in their academic development, but maybe in their personal lives as well, maybe their personal skills?
I think that I don't want to overstep, because as you mentioned, this is a brand new program. So while I don't doubt that we are going to have amazing outcomes, I don't want to generate data that isn't there, but anecdotally isn't there yet. Anecdotally, I think that our students have had a very positive experience with it. And what I saw when I interacted with them, both in the virtual classroom and then face-to-face when we were in London, is that they were making the connections between this intercultural competence material and what we were experiencing. And I'm not sure that when I've been involved in education abroad programs in previous roles in other countries, we weren't as overt. As you mentioned, Andrés, this is not something that even a decade ago, I feel like was embedded in a lot of academic curriculum, and certainly not in business schools. We didn't have such overt conversations about the concepts. And now that we are, we had many, many times in London where one of the participants, and this went for faculty participants as well, they would say, why do you think that just happened? If we'd have a particular exchange, and then the students would be talking about, let's start here, and what about this, and how about this attitude, or how are we interpreting it? And it was such a rising above the theoretical material that we teach them and applying it to a moment, and then being able to step back and say, okay, I've been able to sense make of something that I couldn't before. To me, as an educator, you do want to do a little cheer in the background, because that's why we do this. We don't do this just to disseminate information. We do this to make lives better and open minds, and to see those little tiny sparks actually take light is so exciting.
Exactly. And that's why the experiential learning approach that we have is so important. You just mentioned it, always taking time to think what just happened and why, and how do I feel about it, and how do I make sense of it.
Right. And how am I making someone else feel? I think that's a big focus of, Professor Warren mentioned being aware of our own stereotypes and biases. That's a big piece of cultural competence as well, is not just learning how do I interpret others, because that puts the onus on the other, but how am I interpreting others? And that puts the onus back on yourself. And I think that's firmly where we need to be globally competent citizens.
Absolutely. I wish we had more time to talk about this, because it's wonderful, and we can continue a little bit maybe with some of the questions, but I would like to thank you, Jennifer, so much for this. We're gonna
absolutely
hand it over to Molly, and yeah, let's see what questions the audience has.
While the audience is generating some questions, I'll just go through a couple steps where, if you are interested in implementing this at your organization or your institution, and you want to get some more information, we can provide you with a demo so that you can experience it yourself as a learner. We can set up a video conference with our team, explore the opportunities, and discuss our licensing agreement. I'll just leave this up for a second because I do want to get to any questions that we have before our end of our session. But you can take a picture with a phone if you want to get to the website to request a demo, or you can email us directly after as well. And then the implementation process. So if you've gone through the demo, you've chatted with us, and you're ready to also use this at your organization or institution, there's 4 easy steps. The first one is to sign a licensing agreement, sign up for qualified facilitator training, identify the cohort of learners, if it's part of a course, if it's part of a program abroad, just knowing who that first cohort would be and who the qualified facilitator would be, and then enroll and move forward. So our next sessions for qualified facilitator training are next week on May 10th and 12th, but we also have some sessions coming up in August as well. And we can do a group qualified facilitator training for groups of 6 or more, if you would like your own date and time as well. We'll also be present in person, which is exciting for our team, at CIATAR Europa Congress, May 18th through the 21st. And then we have a booth in the expo hall at the annual NAFSA conference, which is taking place in Denver, Colorado this year, May 31st and through June 3rd. All right. Excellent. So we have just a couple minutes left for any questions that you may have for either or both professors. I am seeing one. Andrés, do you have
I'm seeing
Okay.
a message from Maria saying that she's interested in enrolling, and she's asking if we're going to have a booth at NAFSA in the meantime.
Yes, we will. We will be present at NAFSA. Our booth, I'm going to put it into the chat. We are 1227. So we would love for you to stop by. But we will be in touch with you so that we can send that to you in email as well. I guess I would like to ask just one question for Professor Warren specifically. You know, what Jennifer had mentioned in her conversation is broadening perspectives for these learners. And what I have found is people want to arrive. They want to be globally competent. And what we kind of do with our Global Up programs is almost like open the box further, and more questions arise for the learners, like who's missing from the table when, you know, considering I'm brainstorming a policy change, for example. Whose voice am I not hearing? And like, am I having a narrow perspective? So do you find like, do students get kind of frustrated with kind of the ambiguity that they experience in like broadening their perspectives on their culture and other cultures? Or are they really grateful and excited and ready to go all the time?
Well, all of the above. I think it's, I think the tendency, if a person's not aware of the impact of bias and stereotypes and implicit bias, explicit bias on a person's perceptions and their decision-making process and the actions that they take, then it's kind of like a lawyer coming in and kind of taking over the situation and favoring their own perceptions and just assuming that it's shared by the people they're trying to help. When the more effective way is to come in and understand the people that you have been asked to help and understand, their values, understand their perceptions of the problem, and most importantly, to understand what they believe, what they believe would be solutions for their problem. And I think oftentimes a lawyer might be surprised to discover that what they believe was a solution is not necessarily what the people in the marginalized community is seeking. And a lot of times, the most effective thing that an attorney can do, you would think that, well, it's winning the case, when actually the most important thing that an attorney can often do is to empower the community that has asked for help so that they can be more independent and not necessarily be dependent upon the attorney to be the sole option for seeking relief from the problem that they want to address. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. Yeah. And I can see how for some of those who are seeking to get into, law school, maybe initially wanting to be in that helper role, maybe some coming more in the savior type of role, and then having their mind expanded through this education of, oh, I'm here to actually empower the community and serve as a resource rather than the saving person. So, thank you. I know we're at time. Andrés, is there any other question that you would like to ask?
I think that's in for now, Molly. I don't see any more questions, and I heard so many great things from Carl and from Jennifer. It was wonderful to see how this kind of content can be so flexible and be used in so many different settings. And it's so interesting to see that it is not only for social science practitioners and students, but this can be used in engineering and business and law as well. And I think that hearing that from Professor Warren and Professor Teague was a great example of that.
Yes, thank you both so much for taking the time out of your day and week to join us and provide this type of educational experience for those in our audience today and for us here at AFS. We just sincerely appreciate your partnership. And for those of you who are asking, yes, we recorded this. We will share it with all of you who have registered. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well. And we will provide follow-up and resources to all of you who have requested. So thank you to everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you.
Thank you for having us on.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.